Hey, before we get started today, I'd just like to say that I am my own man. I stand up for myself and I do what I think is right. I do not give in to peer pressure, and I will not bend to what other people want me to do. So, in light of that, let me just start this off by saying, sup. All right, so let's move on to finishing off our idea of quadratics. So, let's look at this particular style of equation. All right, let's say I have the equation x minus 3 squared equals 25. Right? If I wanted to solve this, what we could do is we could take the square root of both sides. Okay? And if we do that, then on the left-hand side, the square root and the square undo each other, and we just have an x minus 3. And on the right side, the square root of 25, if you recall, is plus or minus 5. Right? So this sets up two different equations for me to solve. I have x minus 3 equals 5, and I have x minus 3 equals negative 5. And then I can solve this one by adding 3 to both sides to get x equals 8, and do the same thing over here to get x equals minus 2. So if we can get a quadratic and write it into this type of form, right, which is a perfect square, then it makes some of these types of equations, as you can see from this example, pretty easy to solve. All right? Let's take a look at one more example. If I had x plus 7 squared equals 100, again what I can do is take the square root of both sides, and then that would give me x plus 7 equals plus or minus 10. So I have x plus 7 equals the positive 10, x plus 7 equals the minus 10. I can subtract 7 from both sides to get x equals 3 and x equals negative 17. All right, so again, it's a really nice technique to be able to do. So the big question then is, how do I do that? Okay. Look at this idea. We want to get this equation and put it into its perfect square form. So let's kind of reverse engineer this thing. If I had, how about x minus 4 squared? Right? All that means is to take x minus 4 and multiply it by itself. Right? If we use FOIL on this, we'll get an x squared minus 4x plus 16, which is x squared minus 8x plus 16. Right? And there are a couple things for us to notice. And that's the two numbers here, right? This minus 8, right, and this positive 16. Right? And if you look at this initial statement of x minus 4 squared, that's where they both came from. Because when you FOIL it out, you got the x times the negative 4 once and twice, which added together to give me the minus 8. And then the negative 4 times the negative 4 gave me the positive 16. So it all comes down to this. So if you look at this negative 8x right here, if you notice negative 8, if you divide that by 2, it gives me negative 4. Right? Because again, I added this negative 4x twice. And what about this 16? Well, for the 16, that came from the 4 times 4, which was 4 squared. Right? But remember, they were negative 4s. And negative 4 squared is where I got this 16. Right? So again, it was negative 4 times negative 4, or negative 4 squared, which gave me the 16. Right? So it looks like if we're given some type of equation here, maybe something that looks like this thing, and I want to complete the square on it, it really boils down to that number in the middle, right? That negative 8 in this case. Because if you divide that negative 8 by the 2, that tells me the number here, negative 4, that I'm going to have right up there. Okay, so let's walk through a couple of examples to remind ourselves how we can actually go through this completing the square process. Right? So if I gave you this equation, x squared, how about plus 10x minus 13 equals 0, and I ask you to solve this by completing the square, here's what we would do. Okay? Let's write these x's over here by themselves. And then let's take that 13 over to the other side by adding 13 to both sides. Okay. So let's think about what we need to complete the square. based on what we saw the last time, we need to take half of this number, which was a positive 10. So what I need to add in here, well, half of that number is actually positive 5. So I'm going to add in here a positive 5 squared. And when you do that, remember it's an equation. So if I add that much to the left-hand side, make sure you add that same amount to the right-hand side. And then the way this is going to factor now, it's going to be x plus whatever half of this number was. So in this case, half of 10 gives me 5. Right? So it will be x plus 5 squared equals 13 plus 25 gives me 38. And then I could go about trying to solve this by taking the square root of both sides. Change colors here. And then I will have x plus 5. And this square root of 38 doesn't simplify at all, so let's just write this as plus or minus the square root of 38. That's a little bit bigger than 6 and negative 6, but let's leave it in this form. To get my final answers, let's just take that 5 over to get a negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 38. Right? So the two answers we get here are x equals negative 5 plus the square root of 38 and negative 5 minus the square root of 38. All right, let's try a couple more. What about x squared minus 6x plus 1 equal to 0? Again, let's group the x's together. And let's take that 1 over to the other side. Right. Now let's think about what we need to add to this to start completing the square. Again, it is half of this number squared. Right? So what I'm going to add in here is half of that number, negative 3 squared. And again, since I added that to the left-hand side, let's do the same thing to the right-hand side. All right, and then the way this will now factor is that this becomes x plus, again, whatever number this was. Right? So it'll be x plus negative 3 squared equals, let's see, negative 1 plus 9 gives me 8. Right? And then I could solve this by taking the square root of both sides to give me x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. And then if you add 3 to both sides, you get x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 8. Right? So we have x equals 3 plus the square root of 8, which is a little bit less than 6, and x equals 3 minus the square root of 8, which is a little bit bigger than 0. All right, let's go through one more. Well, okay, we'll do two more. Right? What about x squared plus 12x minus 5 equal to 0? All right, let's again group the x's together to start the process and take the 5 over to the other side. Right? Now, what do I need to add in here to start completing the square? It is half of that value squared. Right? So I will add a positive 6 squared to both sides. Okay. And again, the way this factors, it's x plus whatever number this is. In this case, it's a positive 6. It'll be that quantity squared equals 5 plus 36 gives me 41. And then to solve this, take the square root to get x plus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 41, which is between 6 and 7. And I can take that 6 over to get negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 41. That's my two solutions. All right. And one more here for you, just with another minus sign on there. If I have x squared minus, how about 20x plus 15 equal to 0. Again, let's group our x's together. Take that 15 over to the other side. Let's add half of this number squared to both sides. So I will add a negative 10 squared to both sides. And then this factors into x plus that number, which in this case is negative 10 squared, equals negative 15 plus 100 gives me 85. Right? So this just becomes x minus 10 squared equals 85. Right? If we take the square root of both sides, we had x minus 10 equals plus or minus the square root of 85. I can take the 10 over to get 10 plus or minus the square root of 85. All right. Now that's all well and good. One more thing to think about though is what happens if that number in front of the x squared is not a 1, like all these examples we've had here. So if I had, how about 2x squared minus 16x plus 10 equals 0? Right. Well, again, if all I care about is solving for x, what you can do is you can just divide everything by 2. But if we want to factor it, let's go ahead and pull a 2 out of every term. Right? And if I factor a 2 out of everything, I'll get an x squared, a negative 8x, and a plus 5 equal to 0. Right? And we can now complete the square on this stuff like we have been doing. Right? So let's remember to keep track of that 2 because that's important. I'm going to take that 5 over to the other side, but remember that 5 has to be multiplied by that 2, so the 5 times 2 is 10, and if we take that over, it becomes minus 10. Right? Or if you want to do it this way, at the very beginning, I could have taken this 10 over to the other side, and that would still give me the negative 10 as well. Right? So if I want to start completing the square on this thing, what do I need to add in here to complete the square? Well, again, it is half of that number squared. So I will add a negative 4 squared to both sides. And then this will factor in, don't forget your 2, it'll factor into x plus negative 4 squared equals negative 10 plus 16 gives me a 6. So I have 2 times x minus 4 squared equals 6. And then to solve this, let's go over here. I can now divide by 2, take the square root of both sides, and then add 4 to both sides. All right, let's do one more of these with a strange number out front. And this one, let's make it even a little uglier than that last one. What if I have a 3x squared? How about minus 10x plus 7 equals 0? Right. Well, let's go ahead and take that 7 over to the other side. And now let's factor a 3 out. And remember, when you are factoring out a 3, you are dividing by 3. So this is the same thing as 10 over 3 times x. Okay. So now it's in a form we can use. It's not very pretty, but we can still use it. It's the exact same idea. So don't freak out if you got fractions or some numbers that don't divide nice and neat for you. Just understand the process and know what we need to do. What we need to do is take that number and get half of it. Right? So what is negative 10 over 3 times a half? Well, if you multiply across, you get negative 10 over 6, which simplifies into a minus 5 over 3 if you cancel the 2 out of the top and bottom. Right? So what we will add here then is a plus 5 over 3 squared. So I will add that to both sides. Okay? And let me go ahead and get rid of some of this other junk. All right, so here's what we've got. I've got my 3 on the outside there. This will become x plus, again, whatever half of this number is. And if you notice my little boo-boo, I forgot to put the negative sign inside there. It's not going to matter a whole lot until we get to this point, which means I'll be adding a negative 5/3 squared there. And on the right-hand side, I've got negative 7 plus let's see, 5 over 3 squared is 5/3 times 5/3, which gives me 25 over 9. Okay? All right, and then to finish it off, I've got this 3 times x minus 5 over 3 squared equals, let's see, -7 is -63 over 9 plus 25 over 9 gives me a -38 over 9. So that's what's over here. Okay. And at this point, we could do like we did before, where we divide by 3, take the square root, and solve it. But hopefully when you see this, you've got some concerns. Right? Because this part, since we're squaring it, is always going to be positive. That's the number +3. It's always positive. So there's no way I can multiply a positive times a positive and have it equal to the negative that we've got over here. Right? So in this one, we went through the process and we realized this actually has no solution. Okay. All right, so that is the process for completing the square. We're going to be working on these things in class. It looks kind of bad, but once you get used to them, they go by pretty quick. So once we get a few under our belt, hopefully they'll go pretty well for you, and we'll have some time to answer questions for you too. Right? So hope you enjoyed it. Hope you remembered a whole lot of it, and I will see you all in class.